Good afternoon, everyone.
I'm Kristen Gulang
And I'm Priyan Patrins Pailado
from the College of Allied Health Sciences,
Department of Nursing,
and
we are your hosts for today.
Good afternoon, Priyan. How are you today?
Good afternoon, Christine. You know, I am actually feeling excited today. I am pretty sure that we will be debunking a lot of myths and breaking misconceptions about the COVID-19 vaccination in relation to medical ethics. I am looking forward to learn and discover a lot from the topic discussions later on. How about you, Christine? How do you feel today?
Well, I am sure our participants also feel the same as you do. All of us here are eager to learn from this discussion because as aspiring nurses, we thrive to deliver accurate and reliable information, especially when it involves the health and well-being of the people. But all in all, I am very delighted to be here. I can't wait to share our topic to our fellow Bisayanyans.
Indeed, Christine, I totally agree with you. But before anything else, we would like to introduce and acknowledge the presence of our ever supportive and dynamic Dean of the College of Allied Health Sciences, Mrs. Yvonne Sevilla.
We would also like to introduce and acknowledge the presence of our beloved and energetic program coordinator of the Department of Nursing, Mrs. Jessica Celoria, our supportive instructors, Dr. Hermesal Munoz, and Mr. Raul Nino Moran. Thank you so much for gracing our webinar with your presence.
Once again, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our webinar on Compulsory
or Voluntary
Ethical Considerations for COVID-19 Vaccination with Respect to Patients' Rights. Now, to avoid any unwanted distractions and to ensure the quality and purpose of the webinar, kindly please watch this video for our quick house rules.
To our participants, although we do not require you to open your cameras, we highly encourage you to show yourself during our photo op later. And kindly please use the background posted on the chat box.
Now, without further ado, please help me welcome Miss Marian Alexa Julian Yee to deliver her opening remarks. Let's all give her a virtual round of applause, please.
Dean of College of Allied Health Sciences, Mrs. Yvonne Sevilla, clinical instructors, speakers, distinguished participants, ladies and gentlemen. I am pleased to welcome you into our webinar entitled Compulsory or Voluntary Ethical Considerations for COVID-19 Vaccination with Respect to Patients' Rights. Let me start by acknowledging our Dean in College of Allied Health Sciences, Mrs. Yvonne Sevilla, to our Program Coordinator in College of Nursing, Mrs. Jessica Celoria, and to our Instructor in Healthcare Bioethics, Dr. Hermisel Munoz, for making this webinar possible. Thank you so much, Doc. And to our speakers, Mr. Nino Jan Vergara and Attorney Dax Malone Montealegre, for imparting your time into our webinar despite of your busy schedules. To the committees for working together for this webinar, and to all the participants in this virtual room, good afternoon. The current global pandemic that we are facing today is one of the major problems in our society. We stay at home to prevent the spreading. Thus, we learn our education through online classes. But learning online doesn't produce skillful nurses in the future. That is why scientists invented vaccines that lessens the chances of getting severe effects from COVID-19 virus. But there are still people out there who doesn't understand the importance of getting vaccinated because of their own beliefs and decisions. That is why we came up with this kind of topic to inform everyone about the importance of getting vaccinated. The objectives of our webinar are as follows. First is to inform and educate the masses of their rights as patients to have autonomy of their health choices. Next is to break the common misconception of the COVID-19 vaccines, and lastly is to ensure the conformity with the ongoing mission to achieve herd immunity with the patient's overall health decisions for the alleviation of the COVID-19 status in the country. With this webinar, we will know if it is really compulsory or voluntary to get vaccinated in relation to principles of nursing ethics. And I believe that by participating in this webinar, we can learn new things and ideas that will change our mindsets about COVID-19 vaccination. This is Marianne Alexa Julian Yee, a Level 2 nursing student, and I am happy and excited to welcome you all in our webinar. Just sit back and listen, and let's nourish our thoughts with this fantastic lecture for today. Thank you, and God bless us all.
Thank you for that enlightening and overwhelming opening remarks, Miss Marian Alexa Julian Yee.
At this junction, may we request Ms. Joanna Liz Edmilao to introduce and welcome our first resource speaker for this afternoon.
Our first speaker for today's webinar is a graduate of the University of Cebu Banilad College of Nursing in 2019. He is a regional awardee of the 10 Outstanding Students of the Philippines and a 2019 recipient and the grand winner of the Cebu City Government of the Young Cebuanon Exemplary Action-Driven Leaders. Currently, he is the Vice President for Leadership and Training Development of the Cebuani Youth Ambassadors and a Director for Health and Well-Being of the ULEAD Initiative. He was also the academic in charge and rationalizer for the nursing licensure exam at the Powerhouse Training and Review Center back in 2020. Now, he is the editor-in-chief for the Nucleus publication, a director for communication, and the official local trainer at the Training Bureau, and is the 2022 elect chapter secretary for the Junior Chamber International Cebu. He is also a former COVID ward nurse, for 18 months and now is a clinical nurse educator, a diabetes nurse educator, and a basic life support instructor at the University of Cebu Medical Center. Please help me welcome Mr. Nino John V. Miola.
Okay, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I hope everyone can hear me.
Yes,
Yes,
sir.
sir.
Loud
Loud
and
and
clear.
clear.
That's great. I apologize for the technical difficulties a while ago. Okay, so do we have a chat box here, right? Um, I'd like to request if you can chat on the chat box, our participants, your energy level for this afternoon. Let's see. So I understand that today is an afternoon, right? So also a very holy hour for everyone. And although um, although we started our webinar in this time, so I hope everyone would still listen. And of course, I hope that you can get valuable lessons for for today's webinar. So I'd like to apologize as well. I'm actually in the workplace, so I cannot have my VL for this day. So my topic would be, I'll breeze through the first segment, which is to boost your infodemic immunity, informed choices, and fact checking. And I'll be focusing more on segment two, which will be our focus on your webinar, which is to be or not to be vaccinated, ethical considerations, and caveats on mandatory vaccination. Uh, I'll go through the debunking on the myths. And if you want to learn more on how to do fact checking, and we can proceed on that because I only have rather 45 minutes. Uh, Next slide, please. Or you can give me the a function to move the slides instead.
Sir Nenio, I believe there is a request control option at the top of um, the slide. Is it visible in your end?
It's not. Control option.
Uh, we can just have the technical team to move your slide. You can just tell us when to do so.
Okay, so can we move forward to the debunking of the myths? You can see there myth number one and fact number one. Next slide. Until you can see the myth number one. Anyway, if you want to have a copy of my slides, you can ask the organizers. I am willing to send my slides for everyone's perusal, and so that you can review on fact checking, because it's important when we debunk the myths on vaccination and any other related facts for COVID-19, we should know how to check and confirm the veracity of those. Okay, thank you very much. So I'll just breeze through on this, and if you have further questions, we have a Q&A session after my talk. So myth number one, the vaccine will give you COVID-19. So that is a myth, of course, because the vaccine does not contain any live virus, and it is impossible to contract COVID-19 as a result of getting vaccination. There are various kinds of vaccination. There are dead viruses, or there are also our latest, which is the mRNA vaccine, which we use for our Moderna and our Pfizer. And these vaccines teaches our cells to produce a protein to trigger a necessary immune response. So next slide, please. Next is the COVID-19 vaccine is unsafe because its development was rushed. So that is also a myth, because everyone knows that the clinical trials would usually take 10 to 15 years. However, they try to shorten it because it is a global emergency. Therefore, we have to speed up all the processes, all the to shorten all the processes that goes in between. But definitely, within all those processes involving the clinical trials, the the safety of the vaccine, its efficacy, are not as well rushed. It is make sure that before it was given to the public, it is FDA approved. Also, that it would meet all safety standards for it. So since this is a global effort, so that's why it's more easy to develop or to hasten the clinical trials. Okay. Next slide, please. So next time, if you have more questions, you can ask more of it. I'll try to breeze through this. Next slide, please. Okay. Myth number four, the COVID-19 vaccine causes severe side effects and changes on your DNA. So fact is, vaccine side effects are generally brief, and vaccines do not alter your DNA. And um, remember that because people would hear, or it is the first time for us or for the development in the science community to use mRNA as a vaccine. That's why most people would feel that it could alter your DNA. So most people who doesn't know about the difference between RNA and DNA would feel that that both are actually similar, and that vaccines may alter your DNA. To what? That the vaccine may add on your the transcription on your DNA, the COVID-19 vaccine, until you can pass it on in your birth, that your child will have COVID-19. So it doesn't work like that. So again, mRNA is like a vaccine that triggers a response to the protein by giving it instructions. Okay, so if you have further inquiries on the myth, we can discuss that later on. And if there are other myths that you would like to debunk, you can ask me later on in the Q&A. So for now, I'd like the technical team to please move me to slide 54. We go through the segment number 2. Okay, welcome to our segment number two, to be or not to be vaccinated, right? That is our question for this afternoon. Ethical considerations and caveats on mandatory vaccination. And I think most of us always feel that there should be answer whether vaccination should be mandatory or compulsory or should only be voluntary. Hopefully, we could find our answers in this segment. So next slide, please. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so um, with the given our time limits for this afternoon, we can answer this question um, for those who can or who would like to answer. So I'd like to ask everyone, what are your thoughts and experiences about vaccination? So I'd like to hear from you. Um, does anyone want to answer the question? And if there's none, or if you don't want to answer the question, you may chat it in our chat box available. I'll wait at least 10 seconds, and if no one would like to share, and I'll continue. But if you can still chat your answers in the chat box. So I'm sure everyone has various experiences and their thoughts on vaccination. And I'm sure for almost 2 years with the pandemic, I'm sure everyone will have a lot of things to say. Okay, next slide, please. So what is the reality behind COVID-19? So I think everyone has been wondering, although we have seen everything on the news, what is really reality? Because sometimes we are blended on some misinformation, disinformation, and fake news. So we can first start with that. So next slide, please. Okay. So I hope you're seeing the picture right now. So everyone feels that our social media or Facebook um, turned into an obituary, a virtual obituary. We can almost see a lot of people changing their profile pictures with candles, with black photos, and it's really disheartening. Some people would have a negative impact on this emotionally. Although not everyone who's changing their profile pictures has family members or friends who had died from COVID, but there was a really time, most especially in the first and in the latest wave of our pandemic, and a lot of people were changing their profile pictures, and most of those are related to COVID deaths. So just imagine that reality. A lot of families, there are even children who are orphaned. Both their parents have already died due to COVID. Most especially in the first wave where everything was very new to the healthcare system and to everyone basically. So next slide, please. Okay. Now, our coronavirus cases actually, so you can, technical team, you can press everything until the end of the number. Okay, until that part. So you can see our coronavirus cases is already reached million, so 241 million, and our deaths 4 million, and our recovery are 219 million. So that is already a good number for the recovery. But just imagine all those deaths, 4 million. It means that COVID-19 is truly a global emergency because it doesn't really happen to a specific country. It is global. And with that number of deaths, with that number of cases, it is something that we should turn a blind eye to. Meaning COVID is really real. COVID is not made by politicians. COVID is not made by hospitals to gain more money. COVID is real and COVID is affecting us. So I hope you can ponder on those numbers. Some people would say that there are only small number of people who have been affected by COVID because they cannot really see people dying in COVID, have relatives who's died with COVID. And you're really blessed to not have family members who have died from COVID, friends who have died from COVID. Although that reality, um, although you have not experienced that kind of reality, but it doesn't mean that others have not experienced this. And if you look or you venture to other realities of other people who has suffered from this, and hope that you really believe that COVID is real. Because funny to say, up until now, a lot of people, there's still a minority who doesn't believe that COVID exists. And we're almost 2 years with the pandemic. Right. So next slide, please. So these the numbers or the data shown to you on screen are actually from worldometers.com. So you can search on these numbers. They're going to update this every monthly, and I'm not sure if they can update it every weekly. But I've seen that there have been changes on their data every monthly. So in here you can see on the country. So the countries are actually arranged to the total number of cases. And in here, you can see our top 15, starting with USA with 45 million cases. And we can see India, Brazil, UK, Russia, Turkey, and the rest of the countries. And since we've seen the global picture, we can see as well in Asia. So next slide, please. Okay, so if you can see on this red portion, so in Asia, Philippines again is part of top 10. So it's not a happy thing because it means that we are one of the countries in Asia who has a lot of cases. So of course, India is top one, next Turkey, Iran, Indonesia, and we're the fifth, that's the Philippines. And currently we have 2,727,286 cases with total number of deaths 40,761. There are new deaths with plus 86. Then, as you can see, the mortality and the morbidity rate is really increasing by the day. Although right now, it has the pace of the COVID-19 right now in our country has trying to be more sluggish, which is actually good. And now, the next slide, you can see the first three slides after this, you can see the various the data or the data on each hospitals abroad on the first three slides. You can see that in the hospitalization, most of those admitted are not fully vaccinated, and only a small number of people are actually fully vaccinated. You can see on the first hospitalized in the ICU and on ventilator. And this is from Hillsborough Medical Center. So next slide, please. So another picture from OSF Healthcare. There are 123 hospitalized. So 23 are fully vaccinated, while the 100 are unvaccinated. That speaks volume already. In the ICU, 34 in the ICU, 2 are fully vaccinated, and 32 are unvaccinated. And there are 18 on ventilators. We have 0 fully vaccinated and 18 unvaccinated. So next slide, please. So on the next slide, this is a COVID-19 hospitalizations in the in US. So from August 25, 2021. So you can see 430 hospitalized and also in the ICU and on ventilators. And you can see the numbers on pink. The pink one are actually unvaccinated, and those colored in violet are the fully vaccinated. You can really see the difference on the recovery of the patients. And next slide, please. Okay, now we're in the local aspect. Nationally, so this is a record from DOH. So on the Philippine ranking, so right now we are on our vaccines. So since Philippines is the part of the top five in Asia in the number of cases, so what has Philippines or what has the national government been doing on this? So we can see that there are really efforts coming from our government to help us subdue the number of cases and of course to reach our goal, ultimate goal, which is herd immunity. So you can see that as of October 7, 2021, the Philippines has already administered 48,390,819 doses. And our Philippine ranking, so we rank 22nd out of 205 countries globally. And that means, imagine from 205 countries, we're 22nd. And it means that our efforts to roll out the vaccination is actually good, and you can see other data on the screen. So next slide, please. As well here from DOH, so you can see the percentage of the active cases, the percentage of those already recovered, and those as well, the percentage of those who died. So this is the latest, which is October 20, 2021. So right now, October 22, 2021, you can see 2.5 active cases, then percentage of recovery 96.1, and percentage of those who died 1.50. So next slide, please. Another good news is that we already passed our, we already moved forward from our fourth wave. If you have remembered the news, no, that there are increase in hospital stay, and our hospitals are already full. And right now, from alert number 5 in Cebu, we are already alert number 2, which is a good thing. Our alert level has already been lessened, which means that the hospitals are on a safe zone. So you can see, puno na ba ang ating mga hospital? So ICU beds, only 59% are utilized until the wards 44 utilized. Then in the other, in NCR and the active cases. Okay. Next slide, please. So if you really want to be updated with the numbers, you can check on DOH official page in Facebook and their website. And as well as, again, for the international data, you can use worldometers. And if you want other information on vaccines, you could go to credible sites from World Health Organization, from Center of Diseases, CDC, you can use also DOH, and the like. So the next question is, can we win the fight? So it portrays in this editorial cartoon that the healthcare professionals, our frontliners, are like playing chess with the harbinger of death, which is COVID. So can we really win this fight with healthcare alone? So now let's see. So next slide, please. Okay. So right now, most people, or globally, we have not yet achieved herd immunity because displayed on the editorial cartoon, it's like the phalanx. It's like the phalanx, no, and they use a pun on it, to the phalanx. So you can see a group of soldiers running, being surrounded by COVID, and the other on the right side, the phalanx has been destroyed because of other people who doesn't believe on vaccine. So no to vaccine, stop vaccine, and etc. So the healthcare, the frontliners, the healthcare system could not do this alone. It needs the medical team needs the help and support of everyone for this goal to be realized. The next slide, please. Okay, a very familiar picture if you have seen this on Facebook, on other social media sites. On your left, that's actually in Chongwa. No? Before we could see pictures abroad in India, other people lining up in the hospital. Now it's already in Philippines. You could see hospitals are already full, and because they cannot be admitted, and the patient, the family members could not breathe properly well, so they have no choice but to do this, to line up at the hospital in their cars. The patient would be isolated inside the car with oxygen tanks for support. And sadly, not most of those patients survive. And also here in the hospital that I'm currently staying, UC Med, if you have seen this, no? Emergency room is full. Um, as far as I remembered, in the height of that fourth wave, uh, there were actually 120 people lining up or in the wait list of the ER. And out of those wait lists, sadly, not every one of those in the wait list actually survived, and which is a sad reality right now. We cannot force our healthcare system to just adjust to that number, because on the next slide, there is full capacity of hospitals. And on the next slide, you can see how busy and um, how burnt out our nurses are. And on the next slide, you can see another distinct number, which is, if you have seen this in social media, in one of our local public hospitals, no, kadaghanan sa pasyente, 108, just imagine. And how many nurses are there in the hospital? Two nurses only. And nursing attendant, one. So we really ask to seek everyone's patience, especially during the area. You know, that numbers, just imagine, overwhelmed. The healthcare system is really overwhelmed. And on the next slide, so we'll just read through this. Even the healthcare system or the medical team are not united. Some Dr. Romeo Quijano allegedly claimed that COVID-19s are unsafe, and coming from a doctor himself, and that would really divide the population here in the Philippines. And people would not believe more on vaccines because even the healthcare system are divided, which should not be. And that's why DOH condemns this spreading of misinformation and disinformation on the public. Okay, next slide, please. Also this, most people would tend, when they have a health problem, they would not immediately seek a doctor. They go to the internet, their neighbors and relatives, miraculous drinks and ointments, TV and newspapers, self-prescribed drugs until they're already on their final stage before they go to the doctor. That's how people right now don't trust doctors, or basically, they don't want to go to the hospital because it's costly. It shouldn't be, because that's the only way that you could be properly treated. You could properly be diagnosed with what are you currently experiencing. And a lot of people have been complaining of wearing face masks, face shield. And in fact, on the picture on your right, this is a really is a reality right now, that you cannot, if you feel you cannot breathe properly with wearing face mask and face shield, but if you're already admitted, how much more? You experience difficulty in breathing. You don't want to be alone. Most especially in the first wave with COVID, most of our patients were alone because no SO or significant other can get inside. And on the next slide, please. Okay, so I'd share a bit on my experience. So I was actually a COVID ward nurse for 1 year and 4 months. So I have my fair share of experiences, and I could tolerate as well. I could see as well the improvements of the patients since on after 2021, when there was already a rollout of vaccines, there was already a good prognosis of the patients who has been coming to the COVID ward. So as you can see in the picture, that's actually us. No, we are only two nurses on that shift. That's PM shift or night shift. Usually we have 12-hour shift. Then you can see those emergency carts stand by. Our census, we're already full house. We have 30 patients for the capacity, and we are only two nurses, so we have to divide, so 15 patients. That would be fine if our patients are all stable. But no, we have actually on that day 6 patients who are for ICU. and even our e-cards won't fit, will not be given properly to all of our patients who are who is for ICU, and two of those are actually intubated, and that's why on that night shift we can um, doff our PPE because we have to wait outside just in case the patient the patient would need us. There would be irregularities in his or her vital signs. That's why we're there because on that day, those patients don't have their significant others. And there's a striking question coming from our colleagues. If we leave our jobs now, then who will stay behind and take care of them? So, which made us really ponder and which made us stay for that long. So, next slide, please. So, this is not a picture in UCMed. It's a picture I get on social media. But every time we had codes, you know, when patients are experiencing arrest. So this is the usual, typical scenario we'd see in the COVID ward. And after that, we could not rest. After cleaning it up, we have to go. Another patient is due for code. Another one as well. Then we have to do post-mortem care afterwards. So that's how um, devastating our experience was. So, next slide, please. So I'd like to share as well the best schedule that I had experienced as a COVID ward nurse. So technical team, you can try to click until on the last schedule on Sunday. Hello, technical team. Okay, stop until Sunday. So usually our shift, I told everyone a while ago, we only have from 8 hours, we have 12-hour shift. But then because of the pandemic and because of um, the shortage of nurses, so we have no other choice but to fill in on other shift. So the most best schedule was on Monday, AM to PM shift. We experienced on those picture, those three nurses you see. I'm actually the person in the center, no? So we experienced a 24-hour duty, which is not supposedly. But the next shift was not able to make it because the team was going to be the next. They tested positive in COVID, so we have no choice but to continue. And on Tuesday, I had one off already in Wednesday, 16 hours duty, Thursday, 16 hours duty, Friday, 12 hours, Saturday, 12 hours, and Sunday, 16 hours. So just imagine on that. Oh, that's why if you could, it's really hard for the reality of a frontliner. Um, when we are in the front lines, we're also discriminated. And on those shifts, a lot of people, we have been doing a lot of codes. And on the first wave, second wave, third wave of COVID, when there is no vaccines yet, we feel hopeless because most of the patients who come in usually die. And most of our patients are actually older patients, senior citizens. Most of them really die. And when we endorse, like the next shift would endorse the next patient, the patient already died. When we went inside, the patient already has died. So it was really hard for us to take. It wasn't only a physical dilemma, but we were also affected emotionally, mentally, spiritually. And that was a really hard experience for us. It was traumatic in other sense. But then we were lucky because when the vaccination rollout came, even for me, since I have a comorbidity, I'm asthmatic. So it was really hard for me to stay in the COVID ward. And fortunately, every one of us was vaccinated. And then until we were fully vaccinated, and then we see a lot of patients who are vaccinated. Some of them are partially vaccinated, and some of them are fully vaccinated who are still admitted by COVID. That's still possible. But what happened to them? They did not carry severe symptoms, and it was easy for them to be discharged. Even they were even discharged not 14 days. Some of them went home after 7 days, but isolated at home, which is a good prognosis. And most of those patients, we could really see the difference of the patients who are not vaccinated. Usually, they have bad prognosis. Most of them are already on high flow liters, like 40 liters already for oxygen. Some of them are really intubated. That's how really bad are for those who are unvaccinated. And we can really see that difference personally. And because we also get that data properly, we ask the patients, are they vaccinated or not? And that's how we also record those. And on the next slide, for my future colleagues, no, I'll click on the next technical team. So, padayon gihapon ta frontliners, padayon gihapon nurses. Please don't be afraid of that reality. No, we are the only people on during pandemics or on healthcare crisis. We are the group of people who would be um, who could be the last line of defense for our country and for the whole world. Pero that's why, because we're human, mahuway panagsa. Next slide, please. So, if you've seen this viral photo in China, the doctor beside the patient, not everyone is given the chance to see the sunrise. Let's make most of what we have, be grateful, be thankful, and be blessed. So, if you can ponder on that reality as well. That's why most people would love to see the sunset or the sunrise still, would still love to see their families. That's why they get vaccinated and they see the urgency on that. Next slide, please. Uh, for a while, can I have a pause as well? I'd like to entertain a patient for a while. Um, just give me at least a minute. I apologize.
I think our speaker got disconnected. Please wait for a while. Again, please wait for a while. Thank you.
Hello, hello. I apologize. I had just to give something to the patient. So, I'd like to continue. So, another stories of our vaccination. No, if you've seen this, this is in international news. Misinformation killed her right to be hesitated to get vaccinated, guys, of COVID. So, those are the couple. So sadly, you can see the lead on the news. Exclusive Samantha Wendell was worried that vaccination would affect her fertility. Instead of attending her wedding, her family is now planning her funeral. Actually, she had a change of heart in the middle, but it was too late when they contracted the virus. Um, Her husband to be was able to successfully recover, but her prognosis, the bride, was getting worse. And instead, on the day of her wedding, was actually the day of her funeral. And their families took it really hard for them because they know that they could have avoided it when they could have been vaccinated, when they have been covered with the reality the vaccination may affect her fertility. I mean, she's a bride to be in. Most, of course, if you are on your wedding day, you also be planning on your pregnancy. And as a mom, would like to have, all mothers would like to have a baby, right? That's part of their legacy as well. So it's really hard to decide. And if you feel that you do not get proper information in the internet, then please consult an expert. Please consult a doctor. And that's why I can give the slides to the organizers if you'd like to review on how to do fact checking because it's really hard to fact check a lot right now. A lot, even pictures can be Photoshop, and there are ways for you to actually combat those misinformation, disinformation, and fake news. So next slide, please. So LA man died who mock COVID-19 vaccine dies of virus as well. So you can see those news. Next slide, please. Okay. So right now, the question that we've really been asking, we've heard this in our national government, which is really true. Most of you, if those who've heard about this, bakuna or kulong or bakuna at tulong. So because there was a news that was published that those since the government is rolling it out as a mandatory vaccination on some points or some areas, um, there may be other sanctions for those who are unvaccinated. No, but that actually wasn't a true, let's say, sanction. No, they were just pondering about it. No. But you can see how mandatory vaccination affects us all since mandatory vaccination would impede on someone's autonomy and as well as it would not further help on some cases. And right now, on the next slide, we'll be discussing more on that. And before I really start on ethical considerations, we'd be discussing. I'll be sharing to you a short research that I found from Germany. So as well on the picture on the editorial cartoon on the slide, you could see there are some populations or even around the world, there have been a bad supply of the vaccines or poor supply rather. On the next slide. So I'll discuss briefly on this attitudes and voluntary and mandatory vaccination against COVID-19 and evidence from Germany. Next, please click the slide, please. Um, this was a research that was published on May 2021. And it was a really good research. Based on her data, the SOAP and SOAPCOV is really a reliable representative to do surveys rather, because it covers 30,000 adults within 20,000 households. They actually have 6,700 respondents. Please click the slide. Can we go back? Oh, okay. So there are 6,700 respondents. So next slide, please. So measures they were able to determine the preferences towards vaccination against COVID-19. Next slide, please. Okay, the first argument, there are actually three arguments in here. So actually four, but the fourth one was not established. So on the three arguments, we can start with here. Argument number one, others' willingness to get vaccinated without mandatory vaccination. So we have two opposing views. So those against mandatory vaccination, enough people would get vaccinated or be vaccinated even without a policy of mandatory vaccination. And those in favor, they say that only with a policy mandatory vaccination with enough people to be get vaccinated. So they are really opposing views. On the second argument on the next slide, so you can see misperception of the risk, and we can clarify all of these on when we will be discussing on the ethical considerations. Those who are against mandatory vaccination says that most people overestimate the dangerousness of the virus. Are you really sure that people have been overestimating? Or in favor, most people underestimate the dangerousness of the virus, which is true. You can see the numbers and the data don't lie. So next slide, please. And the argument three, which is the legitimacy of a policy of mandatory vaccinations in general. So those on mandatory says that a policy of it is never permissible, even on the case of very, very dangerous diseases. So in favor of mandatory vaccination, this would be even good, even for less dangerous diseases. So next slide, please. Okay. What are the results? So they were able to get four groups out of those. So four groups of people, and we can see them on the next slide. So they are classified into four out from the research, and even us in the Philippines, we could see these types of groups. Anti-vaccination, interviewees who would not get vaccinated voluntarily against the coronavirus, and as well who oppose mandatory vaccination, or anti-duty. Interviewers would get vaccinated voluntarily, but still oppose a policy of mandatory vaccination. They want to volunteer, but they want to be vaccinated through a volunteer system than something that's compulsory. And on passengers, they don't want to be vaccinated voluntarily. They'll only be vaccinated once it becomes a mandatory coming from the government. So that's what they're seen as passengers or free riders, because they apparently want to see the public good of herd immunity to achieve that goal, but they would not voluntarily contribute to this good. So pro-vaccination, the last one, interviewees would get vaccinated voluntarily and are also in favor of mandatory vaccination. Next slide, please. So out of those, the conclusion, the article investigates the willingness to get vaccinated and the acceptance of the policy of mandatory vaccination. So in Germany, good for them that 70% of the adults, of the respondents rather, would voluntarily get vaccinated. And the second result that on the policy of mandatory vaccination, there are two sides. So half of the population is in favor, half are against. But basically, it's still a win for Germany because 70% would voluntarily be vaccinated. Next slide, please. So that's one thing that they found out as well in the research is that if there's a perfect vaccine without side effects, that would be a typical situation that people would want to be vaccinated. And I think that has that I think that the perfect vaccine is something that people are really looking into, which is really hard to achieve. So next slide, please. So we're right here on our ethical considerations and caveats. So this has been lifted on the policy brief of World Health Organization on COVID-19 and mandatory vaccination, which was published April 13, 2021. So on next slide. So it has been this document, if I'd like to clarify, this policy brief does not in any way endorse or propose um, a mandatory vaccination. Rather, it identifies important ethical considerations and caveats that should that local governments or the national government should look into if they'd like to really push mandating it. At least they have guidelines. There are six guidelines actually in this policy brief, and they could say if they really they could really say that they can push you through a mandatory vaccination if all of these considerations are already on the checklist, which has already been checked on the checklist. So they have to ponder on these ethical considerations before pushing through that policy. So right now, what does mandatory vaccination entail? On the document, of course, everyone would, in contemporary forms rather of mandatory vaccination, there is a notion of imposing restrictions in cases of non-compliance. And on those restrictions, we have seen them. Um, um, Apart from going into the malls, even our workplace, they mandate even private or public places or government, they mandate the people to be vaccinated or else they could not get these services. Okay? However, which has been discussed in the document, mandatory vaccination isn't truly compulsory. Rather, it's not really that absolute because the imposing restrictions are not something that will really indeed or would really discriminate those who are not vaccinated. But still, mandatory vaccination would still limit individual choices in non-trivial ways. So those have been discussed a while ago in those examples that you've seen on screen. That's why World Health Organization banners to work for a good public health education, to push through a better campaign on information dissemination and making vaccines accessible instead of coercing people to be vaccinated. So next slide, please. Okay, so we are in our first ethical consideration, necessity and proportionality. So what do we get from here? So it is mandated as mandates. They should government should think rethink their policy if they'd like it to be mandated. Um, they had to consider um, only if that this would increase the prevention of significant risk, or rather if um, their health objectives cannot be achieved if it's not mandated. So it would feel like a last resort to mandate it. So because they have to consider as well for the public good, concerned if they only increase prevention of significant risk of morbidity and mortality or promote significant unequivocal public health benefits. That's why, again, so if they address, if those concerns are not addressed or are rather addressed ineffectively, that's why a mandate could be considered as necessary because we are looking onto the good of all people or the public in general. So next slide, please. So sufficient evidence of vaccine safety, and I think um, even in the Philippine setting, we have been seeing a lot of posts coming from legitimate sources on the safety of vaccines undergoing clinical trials as well. So another thing that the government should look into before imposing a mandatory vaccination is that consider whether this is authorized for emergency or conditional use and would meet an evidentiary threshold for safety and sufficient for a mandate. So in our setting, you can see the vaccines approved. And this could be another pointer where the government can impose a mandatory vaccination. However, even if the vaccine is considered sufficiently safe, mandatory vaccination should be implemented with no fault compensation schemes to address any vaccine related harm that might occur. So what does that no fault compensation schemes mean? So remember that if you're forcing or coercing people to get vaccinated on a medical intervention that you're trying to claim, then side effects, that is already part of our status quo, that vaccines have side effects. Therefore, what should the government do? It's not the fault of the civilian that he or she had her vaccination. So the government should shoulder those expenses on possible side effects or adverse effects of the vaccine. So it's unfair to require people who experience vaccine-related harm to seek legal remedy from harm resulting from mandatory intervention. So because this would violate the ethical obligation, no, of the government to provide the greater good of humanity. Next slide, please. Another third consideration is, of course, its efficacy and effectiveness. And I think it has been greatly pointed out. So in this consideration, a mandate is considered necessary only if it prevents hospitalization and protect the capacity of the acute healthcare system. It should not be overwhelmed and etc. And there should be sufficient evidence that the vaccine is efficacious in reducing hospitalization. So policymakers should carefully consider whether vaccines authorized for emergency, just like in its safety. So does the vaccine really cut off the transmission of the virus to other people, or um, would it decrease the hospitalization rate, or would the people would be admitted would present less or acute or not severe symptoms of the COVID or other virus? So next slide, please. The fourth consideration is the sufficient supply. There's one thing that we should take note on. How many um, millions of people or billions around trillions around the world, and in the Philippines we have millions as well, or even billion. And if you try to mandate mandatory vaccine or impose rather, do you think that the supply is sufficient? Because that would be really unfair when you try to mandate and those people were not vaccinated because the supply was low. Then, therefore, it has to be considered greatly because the supply of the authorized vaccine should be sufficient and reliable and with reasonable or free access for those for whom it is made to be mandatory. So if you really imposing a mandate on the vaccination only for the senior citizens, it must be accessible to them, and which is also good because in the Philippines or around the world, our vaccination is free, so you don't have to pay for it. And there are a lot of sites as well across local communities who's been offering vaccination, and it would be, of course, burdensome for some people who you made it mandate it if they could not access it, and it would defeat the purpose as well. So next slide. Public trust. This is really important right now. Policymakers have a duty to carefully consider the effect that mandating vaccination could have on public confidence and trust, particularly on confidence in the scientific community and public trust in vaccination generally. And I think Philippines had a hard time overcoming it at first because of the recent um, issue on dengue vaccine. If you remembered, if everyone remembers about dengue vaccine and its effects. Because of that, there was a decrease in immunization rates for the newborn and for children. And how much more when the COVID-19 went into the picture of everyone, and another vaccination, would that be a hoax? Would that kill us? Would that increase the money, pocket money of politicians? Would that only be beneficial for healthcare system or like that, for example? So it's just really hard, and they have to make sure when they make it a mandate, they have to make sure that it would not compromise the image of the scientific community. It's really hard for our scientists, our doctors to push through evidence-based practices and approved products when people don't have trust anymore? And how can we communicate that properly to the public or to the general populace? So most especially on those who are already historically advantaged. Well, that's why a while ago we are already historically at disadvantage because of what happened in Dinvaksha. How much more in other countries internationally when it was used by the Central Intelligence Agency. They try to use a fake vaccination right for flu in order to get through and try to assassinate Biden. And on that country, it was really already hard for them to trust vaccination because of what happened. So it could be a ploy for or a scheme, political scheme. So next slide. So the last ethical consideration is the process of decision making. So you can see the word highlighted transparency in stepwise decision making. So by legitimate public health authorities, which should be a fundamental element of ethical analysis. So reasonable effort should be made to engage affected parties and relevant stakeholders. And we have also to highlight there um, uh, transparency and the steps, right? So does the government make sure that those who had their first dose had already secured for the second dose, and are they given their proper schedules, or those people who had um, filled up the registration for the vaccine have been entertained, because that's another issue even here in Philippines, and um, not only in Philippines, even in abroad. You know, some people are not. They feel that they're not entertained when they try. They're waiting for a text message coming from DOH or from other local sites for the vaccination, but it had turned months already, 3 months, 4 months, but they have not yet been texted. So that's another thing that we should try to work on or consider. If we try to mandate, if it really want to mandate rather vaccination, then we have to make sure that the steps has to be clear, the process has to be clear, and that the government should be transparent about it. And um, on the next slide, we'll also be focusing as well on the context of the mandatory vaccination. Who are the stakeholders or who are affected generally? So it has been summarized in the document three. So we have in the first one, we have the general populace or the public. So next slide, please. So here, more evidence may be required about vaccine uptake to determine whether a mandate is necessary. So which will depend on local context and on the goal of the health system, which is achievement of herd immunity, protecting the most vulnerable. And similarly, the extent to which a mandate for the general public is proportional and will depend to some extent on the local context given the variation in COVID-19 epidemiology in different jurisdictions. So would you really when you try to government will try to impose a mandatory vaccination, um, are you really sure that the public has been duly informed about this? Has this been cascaded properly, or rather even information dissemination about what this vaccine is, and etc. So this one is a really big dilemma that should be answered when you try to impose it. A lot of people are affected. A lot of people, most especially those who are not in the medical field, would not understand its importance, right? So, what would you do on that if you make it a mandate? So you would create insurgents on the population. There would be a group of people who would try to claim that their freedom has been violated by the government and etc. And it will create more chaos. So if they can fix that on that part, then mandatory vaccination would be good. And if not, then the results would be really bad. So on the next slide, will also be considered the children or those who are going to schools. So basically, on the next slide, please, we would note that those below 18 or below 12, as study shown, there's still been a lack of data whether children should be vaccinated or children are safe from vaccines, or their immune system could process properly the vaccination, even those mRNA, or would the children would able to hold on to the adverse or the side effects of vaccines. That's why, since there is a lack of data, it would impede other ethical considerations, and that's the reason why it's not yet authorized for this population. So consequently, vaccination is not currently ethically justified for attending school. So um, it would until there's already enough evidence that is already good for children, most especially those below 18 or rather below 12, since there are already evidence that 12 children starting from 12 have good prognosis on the vaccines. And policymakers will have to consider whether mandating this is a condition of attending school. So this is like a way of them to try to encourage children, if they really want a face-to-face class, then they should be vaccinated. But another question would rise: is it really safe for them? So for those, most especially in medical field, most of us, even from University of Visayas, you might be having your face-to-face. I don't know, but in UC, in San Carlos, and other schools, they already have their face-to-face, and most of them are already vaccinated. If I'm right. And of course, since 18 and above would be entertained for vaccination, then possibly it could be another good way, probably for the government to mandate it. But if 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 it's not proven effective, then you cannot coercively put efforts on those. So on the next slide, which is as well a big dilemma in the healthcare team. So as you can see on the news, no, even the healthcare system or the medical team is also divided. Next on the next slide, please. So on the news, you can see that a doctor claims that the vaccines are unsafe despite the rigorous data or the rigorous efforts of international community to publish important evidence on the efficacy of vaccines, and that's really hard. So um, I'd like everyone to know that when you said you're trying to research it, I think most of you in your third year or fourth year would be able to encounter research. In the term research, most of you would feel when you first hear the word research, it's already giving you aches in your mind because research is really hard. You know? You cannot just possibly say that your output that after having research on social media or other sites that it's already good. Then you present it to the panel. It doesn't work that way. There are a lot of processes that involves around it. And that is why we cannot really say that for the public that they would not trust the scientific community on it. They have been on the academe for how many years, been practicing that, and for someone who just researched it when they were having their CR break on their cell phones, after 5 minutes, they would conclude vaccines are not safe. Compared to the scientific community has been doing it for how many years and has been providing data, who has been providing proper research on it. And we try to compete with them. Are you really sure? So that's a question one you should ask. Um, for for the medical team or the healthcare system, our data is always evidence-based. So please remember that term, evidence-based. So we cannot just do this. A lot of practices in our return demonstration also have been changed in our setup in the area because as scientific community do the researches, there have been other data that supports other claims that this practice is bad, so you have to change it. Like for example, when you mix um, um, epinephrine from NSS, it's not good. It would decrease the potency of the drug. So you mix it with D5 water or D50. So on um, uh, other cases of those research. So next slide, please. Hello, technical team. Okay. Hello. Hello. You can still see me? Okay, thank you, thank you. Can you please go back to the healthcare? Um, if okay, health workers. So this is as well a very big dilemma right now because healthcare workers right now have been divided into two sides. Those are pro-vaccination and those who are not. So mandatory COVID vaccination might appear to be particularly plausible because it is part of the obligation of a healthcare worker to be vaccinated for for the protection of their patients and to protect the health system capacity. And because most of us are frontliners of certain pandemics, so we have to be identified as the priority. So there are a lot of cases of nosocomial infections, and much worse if you would have nosocomial infection for COVID. That's unfair for patients because they go into the hospital to be um, well or to be cured, but then you are trying to put them um, on harm's way. So on the next slide, please. So vaccines are effective for protecting people from COVID-19. So governments or institutional policymakers should use arguments to encourage voluntary vaccination against COVID-19 before contemplating mandatory vaccination. Efforts should be made to demonstrate the benefit and safety of vaccines for the greatest possible acceptance of vaccination. Stricter regulatory measures should be considered only if these means are not successful. So what does the conclusion of that policy brief mean? It means that for World Health Organization, it's still important for us, it's our prime duty rather, to do a good strategy for a public health education because we know that ethically there will be a lot of violation for the rights of the people when we try to force a mandatory vaccination. If you could still try to improve our marketing team, our information dissemination on how, because most of the people in the masses don't understand English and they don't understand complex medical terms. And therefore, how could you help them? So it really takes patience. And of course, it takes a social and a behavioral science to fix everything. We have to see how people respond. And for example, other cases and how why people, you can, another example, why people are trust koi herbal capsule more than vaccination. So how does koi herbal capsule have their marketing to the masses? Through what? Testimonies. So you can, if you put testimonies on people, you give them those testimonies, that probably they might believe vaccination. But another crucial thing in education is that in science we don't hide anything. It is unethical for us to hide side effects of vaccination because everyone has the right to know what are possible side effects. And probably that might be something that's hindering other people to be vaccinated because on the research that was stated a while ago, people would want to be vaccinated if there is a perfect vaccine. Other people right now are still waiting for a perfect vaccine because they think that we are being experimented. But That's the thing. Most everyone tries to downplay and delay because of sorts of reasons. They don't see the urgency to be vaccinated. So that's why, if um, all of these be would come down to an end, people could not do proper. The people or the masses could not be able to listen properly. Then maybe the last resort would be mandatory vaccination. So on the next slide, um, we'd like to review on our certain laws in nursing. Your favorite, Totoo, meaning true, or 220, Board of Nursing Board Resolution number 220, series of 2004, the promulgation of the Code of Ethics for Registered Nurses. So on the next slide, I'd like to only highlight two um, ethical principles, Section 8 and Section 14. And as well, in contribution to the argument stating that nurses, or the medical team rather, should be vaccinated for the safety of their patients. So ethical principle number 4, and as well rather on other portions on health education. And you can see here in section number 8, ethical principle 4, registered nurses are the advocates of the patients. They shall take appropriate steps to safeguard their rights and privileges. So we are advocates of our patients, meaning we don't hide to them some information. Meaning we should tell them um, um, everything about vaccines. And it's up to us how we could encourage our patients to be vaccinated and safeguard them to be vaccinated. If we are really advocates of our patients, then we should be good examples. If we're trying to give education that they should be vaccinated, then we too should be vaccinated. And your patient would ask, ma'am, are you vaccinated? No, I'm not. And they'll ask the reason. And because of that, they'll think that you're lying, that there is no sincerity in your words. Because even you could not practice that. That's unfair for them. Even on the section 14, ethical principles, one, the preservation of life, respect for human rights, and promotion of a healthy environment shall be a commitment of registered nurse. The establishment of linkages with the public in promoting local, national, and international efforts to meet health and social needs of people as a contributing member of society is a noble concern of a registered nurse. Just imagine, establishment of linkages with the public, promoting local, national, international efforts. Our duty as a nurse does stop when we are in our hospital or other fields of expertise. We should also contribute to the greater good by helping national, local, and international efforts because we know that we have the knowledge and we have the resources to contribute to that and to help people. On the next slide, please. So, Republic Act number 9173, our nursing law, an act providing for a more responsive nursing profession, repealing for the purpose of Republic Act number 7164, otherwise known as the Philippine Nursing Act of 1991, and for other purposes. So I hope you have to review on this, the ethical code and our nursing act, nursing law, Philippine Nursing Act of 1991. So I'd like to highlight this on only Article 6, nursing practice, the scope of nursing. So in support of a while ago from our ethical code, provide health education to individuals, families, and communities. So when you say health education in that part, if you provide health education, you have to make sure you know the topic. So if you yourself you don't believe it, that would be hard. So you have to study more. So getting information or being educated does not stop in the four corners of our institution. We have to explore more, we have to venture more, we have to ask more, we have to be more critical. And I think that um, health education, we should first educate ourselves. And are you really sure the vaccines are unsafe? Because there are a lot of claims that a lot of people have died from vaccine. You have personally seen that your grandmother has died because after vaccination, she just collapsed and didn't breathe already. Are you really sure your claims are right? You have to make sure again, everything that you say, everything that you act is evidence based. And we are not only dealing with ourselves, we also rather cascades to our patients, their families, and the communities. That's how big our scope is. That's how big our responsibility as a um, medical practitioner. So on the next slide, you could see your Florence Nightingale pledge or the Nightingale's pledge. So I like to highlight only this part and devote myself to the welfare of those committed to my care. You could see that uh, we have the responsibility to devote ourselves. You know, so if we really devote ourselves to the people that we are giving our care to, then you know that you should be vaccinated. You never know, even if you're wearing your PPE, you're wearing your mask, even if the patient is vaccinated, there's still a lot of possibility that you could transmit that. And if you are trying to lobby for good cause, then it's a sad news for you because you're not doing it well. So we have to remember everything from our ethical code, from our Philippine nursing law, from the Nightingale's pledge. We keep on saying it, but those became empty words if you don't really try to um, embody everything that has been stated. So on the next slide, this would be my second to the last slide for this segment. Okay, so it was discussed a while ago. So please flash the screen until the last, which is veracity. Okay, so I've only highlighted only 7 ethical principles in your bioethics. So I'll try to discuss a bit on it. So on the first one is autonomy. So when you mandate um, mandatory vaccination, that would defeat as well the purpose of the individual or the patient for their own self-care. So remember in the hospital, we do consent, right? So you cannot do an invasive procedure without the consent of your patient. The operating room, the doctor could not perform the operation with the patient who did not sign it. That's really important. We have to highlight this on the nurses who should not try to fake signatures for consents. That is really bad. It violates the ethical principle of autonomy. We should decide, let our patients decide. And that's why mandatory vaccination would create a big impact on autonomy on the patients. Um, then for next is beneficence. So what is beneficence? Which is doing good and the right thing for the patient. What's the right thing to do? Is to be a good example of them, so to be vaccinated. Accountability. So we are responsible of our own actions. Whatever happens, if there's an nosocomial infection because of us, because we're not yet vaccinated, and what would you do? And there is always a professional and a personal consequence that would incur on that. And non-malfeasance or non-maleficence, which is quite the opposite of not the opposite, but quite similar to beneficence, but it's highlighted there, doing no harm. Because harm could be intentional or non-intentional. Um, for you, you're trying to do your best, even if you're not vaccinated, for your patients not to be you cannot pass on the virus to your patient. However, although it's not intentional, the patient still became positive, and it was also noted that when you had your test, you were also positive. And who would be the direct contact for the patient? And then absolutely, that's you as the nurse, and you should be accountable for that. And you have also done harm to your patient, which is really bad. So justice. Justice also means fairness. We should be fair when we distribute our care. So right now, as I told you a while ago, there are 2 forces right now, or maybe 4 out of the research: anti-duty, anti-vaccination, pro-vaccination, and the passengers. And we should not discriminate our patients because you're an anti-vax person. When you ask them, are you vaccinated? Di ko mo tuog vaccine mo, ana imong patient. Di mo na kahala. Age 18 ako gamiton ani sa IV da. Kani si patient kay anti-vax pero ka-feel siya ng bati or tuyuon nimo nga matakdan siya, makuha ka something sa COVID ward para matuo siya. It's very injustice for them. So your duty as a nurse, remember, is to do health education, encourage them, and they have to they should deserve a same equal treatment as what you did with other patients who are vaccinated or pro-vaccinated or who are pro-vaccination. So veracity is telling the truth completely. This in the part when we try even if we are not on a hospital setting, even we're at home or we're with our friends, you should practice veracity. You like to try to encourage your mother to be vaccinated. You try to hide to them the consequences or rather the side effects. What would happen? Your mother would panic. Now, why am I feeling dizzy? Why is my heart palpitating so much? Or what's happening to me? Why am I very weak, experiencing body malaise? So that's also your fault for hiding something. That's your responsibility, most especially in hospital setting, to tell the truth. So don't put someone in the dark for the side effects because side effects are really true, and that's something that we should acknowledge. There is no perfect vaccine, and we should take to note that we have to weigh in the benefits, and it has already been proven that vaccines, um, its benefits outweigh the risk, and that's why we should push through for vaccination. And the last is fidelity. So fidelity is being faithful or keeping to one's promises. So if we promise them that we provide a quality and safe care, if that's the hospital's mandate, so if they want their patient to be vaccinated, then they might push through to the uh, mandate for the nurses to be vaccinated. So another thing is, so before I end ethical principles, so a lot of nurses claim when they are forced to, if you've heard this, no jab, no job. So most especially on COVID ward nurses like me before, we are really mandated to be vaccinated because we are the front lines with people experiencing who has COVID. And if we go at home, what will happen? We will be spreading the disease if we're not vaccinated. So some other people would feel that they don't want Sinovac because it's not yet. They'd rather wait until Pfizer arrives so that they'll be vaccinated. That's unfair for other people. It's unfair for your patients. You're working on the area and you're not vaccinated. And yes, the dilemma is an autonomy, but we have to remember the other ethical principles as well. Beneficence and non-maleficence, of course, precedes autonomy. If you have to rank them, if you want to get vaccinated as a nurse working in a hospital setting, then autonomy should not be your first choice. It has to be beneficence and non-maleficence. You have to think of the greater good of humanity and all your patients. That should sink in. That's your responsibility. It's lying on your shoulders. You have to think on that. And if you really don't want, then you have to resign because of your personal choice not to be vaccinated. Okay, if the hospital could not force you, they could not encourage you, then you have to step down because you know yourself you could be a carrier of the virus. So on the last slide, technical team. So in the first, if you the second question I raised a while ago, can we win this fight? You could see that only healthcare professionals on the picture doing the chess game with our with COVID, no? But they could not win because it's only the healthcare team. And in here on the slide, we can only win if we fight together. This is not the fight only of healthcare system or the healthcare professionals, but it is a fight globally from everyone, from various professions, every individual, children, mother, parents in general, everyone should be harmonized and unified so that we could achieve this goal. We don't want to increase mortality and morbidity rates. It's already tiring to be doing virtual webinars, virtual classes, or webinars such as this when we could do this online, which is more interactive. there are a lot of COVID has really took a lot of time to spend with our loved one. And if you really want to see still our family members, we should contribute to this greater good. And that would be my last slide. So thank you everyone for listening, and I hope you get a lot from it.
Yun na ako.
Thank you for that very informative and wholesome talk, Mr. Nino Jan Mayole.
Now for the open forum, participants may address their questions and clarifications to the speaker by raising your virtual hand, or you may use the chat box. Please wait for the facilitator to recognize you before turning on your microphones. If you have any queries, you may already raise it now.
We would also love to acknowledge Sir Jasper Mobilia. Good afternoon, sir. Thank you for gracing our webinar with your presence.
Now let's proceed to the open forum. Anybody in the chat box who would like to raise their questions? Miss Ayla Munoz. Yes, Mr. Eldred. Mr. Eldred Condias, do you have any question?
Ah, madungog ra ko.
Can you speak louder, Sir Condias?
Madungog ra.
Still not clear?
Kaning Miss Kailad.
Can you can you just put your question in the chat box so that we can read them for you? Okay, so I will read this question from Ayla Munoz. She said that I'm experiencing side effects of AstraZeneca right now, such as muscle pain and fever, but that's normal, sir, right?
Hello. What was the name of the person who asked?
It's Miss Ayla Munoz.
Okay, Miss Ayla Munoz. So thank you for that question. Actually, I'm also vaccinated with AstraZeneca. So also feel the same side effects of the vaccine. And that is normal on the process of AstraZeneca. So it means that the vaccine in AstraZeneca, it has a different process when, for the vaccination. You'll be able to know that it has been really effective on you when you feel those side effects. That's why sometimes people would try to compare it with Sinovac, because most people who has been jabbed with Sinovac doesn't feel any side effects. That's because Sinovac was its process was aligned to the normal immunization process or other vaccinations, like in polio, in measles. It has the same process. That's why it's similar to how our body normally works, and our body has already instituted that kind of immune response. So thank you. Any other?
Thank you, Sir Nenyo. I hope Sir Nenyo answered your question, Miss Ayla. Is there anybody here who have questions? You may type it in the chat box. So we are going to wait for 30 seconds, and if there is no question being raised, we will be proceeding to the next segment of this webinar.
Okay, so thank you participants for raising your questions, and thank you Sir Nino for answering them. Now to formally express our gratitude to our first speaker, Mr. Nino Jan Mayole, allow us to present this certificate and token of appreciation for you.
Certificate of Appreciation is presented to Mr. Nino John Vergara Miole, RN, for sharing his expertise as a resource speaker during the webinar on compulsory or voluntary ethical considerations for COVID-19 vaccination with respect to patients' rights, held via MS Teams on October 22, 2021 from 1 p.m. to 3:30 p.m. Given this 22nd day of October 2021, signed by Mrs. Jessica V. Siloria, our program coordinator, Mrs. Yvonne M. Sevilla, our Dean of College of Allied Health Sciences, and Dr. Hermisal Munoz, our instructor. We have also prepared a personalized tumbler as a token of appreciation. Thank you so much, Sir Nino, for being our resource speaker for today.
At this point, may we request everyone to turn on your cameras and show us your sweetest smiles for the photo opportunity with our resource speaker.
Okay. Okay. 1, 2, 3, smile. Wacky pose. 1, 2, 3, smile.
Okay, thank
you so much. Thank you so much, Sir Nino. Now, before we proceed to our second resource speaker, let's have some quick icebreaker. So we have prepared trivia questions, and whoever answers it first will win a prize.
Wow, I really love prizes. Too bad the host can't join this segment. Anyway, in order for us to acknowledge your answer, participants must first comment on the chat box the letters U and V with a green heart, such as the one flashed on your screens. The participant who can type and send the letters UV with a green heart will be acknowledged by our facilitators and will be given a chance to unmute their microphones, answer the question, and win a prize.
That sounds easy. Now may we call Tess Morales to read the questions.
Okay, for the first question, what does COVID-19 stands for? A. It's a term for coronavirus disease 19 because it is the 19th strain of coronavirus discovered. Or B. It's a term that stands for coronavirus disease 2019, the year it was first identified. What is the answer for that?
B.
Okay, very good. It's letter B. It's a term for coronavirus disease 2019, the year it was first identified. According to the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases, coronaviruses are a family of viruses that typically impact the respiratory tract and are common in people and many different species of animals. A new type of coronavirus, SARS-CoV-2, has been found to cause what we now call COVID-19. The first case of COVID-19 was reported in December 2019. Okay, for question number 2. So what other viruses belong to the coronavirus family? A. SARS and influenza, B. SARS and MERS, or C. SARS and HIV? What is the answer? Anyone?
Please type UV with a green heart on the comment box. Thank you.
What is the answer? Is it A, B, or C? Yes,
B.
it's letter B, SARS and MERS. In addition to these new or novel coronaviruses, there are at least 6 other coronaviruses that we currently know of. According to CDC, 4 of them are extremely common and generally cause only mildly symptoms, like the ones we might experience if we had a cold. Before the current pandemic, there are 2 known types of coronaviruses that could prove more harmful and potentially even fatal. MERS-CoV, the coronaviruses that cause Middle East Respiratory Syndrome, and the SARS-CoV, the coronaviruses that causes severe acute respiratory syndrome, is a third of this kind, and SARS-CoV-2 is a third type of this kind to be discovered. Okay? And that would be the end of my trivia question. Thank you.
Congratulations to all the winners. All your names are being listed and we will be giving your prizes later on.
While waiting for the second resources speaker, let's be entertained with this production number prepared by MJ and R. A virtual round of applause, please.
Picture perfect memories scattered all around the floor. Reaching for the phone 'cause I can't cut it anymore. And I wonder if I ever crossed your mind. For me it happens all the time. It's a quarter after 1. I'm alone and I need you now. Said I wouldn't go, but I lost some control and I need you now. And I don't know how I get to go without. I just need you now. Another shot of whiskey, can't stop looking at the door. Wishing you could sweep me in the way you did before. And I wonder if I ever cross your mind. For me it happens all the time. It's a quarter after 1. I'm a little drunk and I need you now. Said I wouldn't go, but I lost all control and I need you now. And I don't know how I got to go without. I just need you now.
Thank you for that wonderful rendition, MJ and R. Indeed, Visayanians are not just academically excellent, but we are also gifted and talented.
Now, without further ado, may we call on Ms. Stephanie Jaime to introduce and welcome our second and last resource speaker for this afternoon.
For our second speaker, he was a Jerry Rojas Leadership Awardee and an Eagle Scout Awardee of the Boy Scouts of the Philippines and a recipient of the Medal of Honor for Bravery and Heroism. He was also an International Peace Exchange Scholar of International Christian University in Tokyo, Japan in 1996. He was awarded one of the 10 outstanding students of Region 7 and qualified to the 10 outstanding students of the Philippines. He completed Bachelor of Science in Physical Therapy in Silliman University, Dumaguete City, Negros Oriental in 1999. He passed the PT Board examination in 1999. He completed Bachelor of Laws in University of St. Losal, Bacolod City, Negros Occidental in 2004. He passed the Real Estate Brokerage licensure examination in July 2007. He also passed the Patent Lawyer qualifying examination in June 2008. He is now a member of Sangguniang Panglungsod and in the local government of Canlaon City, Negros Oriental, and also known as the chairman of both the SP Committee of Human Rights and Public Information and the SP Committee on Ethics and Good Governance. He is also a member of board directors and a corporate secretary of the Jokay Marine International Corporation, and he was also a broadcaster or a radio anchor of TV5 Cebu City, Philippines. He is a lawyer. Chief legal counsel, in-house counsel, retained legal counsel, and acted as municipal attorney for 2 years at the local government of Moises Padilla, Negros Occidental. Let us all welcome our Honorable Attorney, Dax Maloney P. Montealegre. A round of applause, please.
Thank you very much for that generous introduction. I am now going to give you my talk about compulsory or voluntary ethical consideration for COVID vaccination with respect to patients' rights. Before we proceed, I would like to discuss on whether or not COVID vaccination is compulsory. I'd like to inform everyone, the students of nursing students of the University of Visayas, that is purely voluntary, even though that there was a bid to make it mandatory. An individual has the right to decide whether or not they will receive COVID-19 vaccine. It is the right of the person to decide on his own if he shall receive or will not receive the vaccine. So this has been the stand of the World Health Organization, even in countries in Europe and United States of America. So this is not mandatory. So there has been discussions whether or not COVID-19 vaccination would be made mandatory or just voluntary prior to the government's inoculation rollout in March this year. The decision was based on the principles that we adhere to, based on the World Health Organization end-stage recommendation that these shall purely be voluntary. While citizens have a moral obligation to get vaccinated for the welfare of their loved ones, communities, and the Philippine population, the public cannot be mandated to receive the COVID-19 vaccine since the available jobs are still in their developmental stage. So our talk will be about the ethical considerations for this vaccination. So now we all know that this is purely mandatory. So may I request the technical persons to please proceed with the slides. So you have an option to click on my face if you want to listen to what I'm saying, or if you just want to read, then you can click on the slide. Let us proceed. So our topic for today is about compulsory or voluntary ethical considerations for COVID vaccination with respect to patients' rights. Next slide, please. The doctrine of informed consent puts into effect respect for the patient's autonomy and their right to self-determination. So this will now be the doctrine that we're going to study today because this deals about consent. So what is consent? Next slide, please. This consent is similar to the, the term of voluntariness. It requires that the patient's consent to treatment be free of coercion, duress, or undue influence. This is an important consideration when it comes to vaccines. So we cannot force our patients to be vaccinated. So that is why it is purely voluntary. Next slide, please. The COVID-19 pandemic has raised a multitude of complex ethical issues, and the new ones present themselves daily. These issues include those related to vaccination, arise at four levels. And what are these? Next slide, please. The first level is micro or individual. For example, when a doctor vaccinates a patient. Second is meso or institutional, regarding, for instance, a hospital's or aged care residences policy on vaccinating its staff. Third level is macro or societal. It is the government's decision or public health regulations governing distribution of vaccines and access to vaccination. And finally, we have the fourth, mega or global, such as a nation's obligations to provide vaccines to those in developing countries which are without vaccines. So this is a problem of India before, when a lot of people died because vaccines were not readily available. Next slide, please. In many COVID-19 related decision making situations at each of these levels, decision makers face what is called in bioethics a world of competing sorrows. That is, decision making in which there is no harm option, but in which instead they must choose to whom harm will be allocated. Next slide, please. The ethical difficulties are exacerbated when the harms and benefits do not accrue to the same people, or at least not in equal measure. A striking example of such a situation at the macro or societal level would be the use of lockdowns, with a choice between protecting the public health and inflicting serious economic harm. So this has been a problem in Cebu because the governor, Gwen Garcia, has to choose whether to continue its lockdown or open Cebu to economic activity. Because as we all know, there has been a damage brought about by lockdowns. So there is zero economic activity. This does not only affect the Philippines or Cebu in particular, where most of you are situated, but global. So in fact, if you look at around us, a lot of companies have already closed. Your favorite brands have declared bankruptcy, and some of your favorite hotels are closed, malls are closed, restaurants are closed. And by the time that this is over, a lot of this will be closed forever. Let us proceed. Next slide, please. What we want to focus on here is a particular micro level issue, that of a healthcare professional's obligation to obtain a person's informed consent to COVID-19 vaccination. So how do we ask our patients? How do we decide? So these are what you call the ethical considerations affecting nurses. Failure to obtain an informed consent to or an informed refusal of medical treatment, which includes vaccination, is medical negligence. Take note. I've been a lawyer for about 17 years and I have sued doctors for medical negligence. So, as nurses, before you inoculate or before you stick the needle at the arm of a patient, you have to obtain informed consent. This is not just ordinary consent, but informed consent, which means you don't get the consent without informing the patient the pros and cons of vaccination. Next slide, please. Informed consent to or refusal of medical treatment has three requirements. First is competence, information, and voluntariness. There is a wealth of research on what is needed to establish each element, but here is a brief summary. Next slide, please. First, we talk about competence. The law presumes that all adults are competent until proven otherwise. In the Philippines, our age of maturity or our legal age is 18. So which means, as nurses, before you uh, elicit consent, you should make sure that the patient is 18 years old and above. Children are not presumed to be competent, so which means all those below 18 years of age, you have to be very careful because they cannot give consent. They cannot even enter into contracts. So any contract entered into by minors is considered null and void. The same is true with the consent that they give. If a minor or a child gives its consent to inoculation or vaccination, that is still null and void because, as we said, children under the law are not presumed to be are not presumed to be competent. But those with the required mental capacity can be found competent to give an informed consent. What are we talking about here? We are talking about the parents of the children, which means if there is vaccine already available to children, before you inoculate or before you stick a needle, you should get the consent of the parent. Next slide, please. Competence requires that the person must be able to understand the information they are required to be given in order to obtain their informed consent or refusal and be able to appreciate the make. So it is our job as nurses to inform our patients the pros and cons of vaccines. Remember, vaccine is still in its developmental stage. Nothing is sure. We don't even know what we will be a year from now. A lot of people say that we will be turning into zombies, but we have to find out. Next slide, please. Medical treatment decisions for incompetent persons must be made by a competent substitute decision maker. We're talking about parents. Parents here are the substitute decision maker. If parents are not available, we're talking about guardians, the lolo, the lola, uncle or auntie. It depends on who the minor are living with. These are the persons who implements what they believe would be the competent person's preferences and acts in the best interest of the incompetent person. So when we talk about incompetent person under the law, we're talking about children. When we're talking about children, we're talking about persons less than 18 years of age. Let us proceed. Next slide, please. The second element is information. All the information that would be material to a reasonable person in the same circumstances as the person seeking vaccination must be disclosed, along with any additional information the healthcare professional knows or ought to know that the particular person would want to know, including honest answers to all of the person's questions. So what we know as healthcare professionals, what we know as nurses should be disclosed. We should not uh, tell them nothing, everything all the side effects of vaccination. The patient should be informed. Next slide, please. Risks of death are always regarded as material risk, even if of a very low probability. This explains the temporary suspension of using AstraZeneca vaccine in the Philippines and in Australia in order to add disclosure of the rare risk of fatal blood clots or cerebral venous thrombosis to the consent form signed by the patient or the person. So in some cases or in some countries, they sign a consent form stating that they allow themselves to be inoculated by AstraZeneca despite the fact that there is a finding of cerebral venous thrombosis as a side effect. Next slide, please. To obtain an informed consent to or informed refusal of any given treatment, the person must be offered all medically indicated treatments and the risks, harms, benefits, and potential benefits of each, and of refusing all treatment must be disclosed. So it is a medical malpractice if we forget to inform these risks. It will be negligence on the part of the professional or the healthcare professional if they don't tell everything to the client or to the patient. Next slide, please. Failure to do so would negate informed consent to any vaccine given, even possibly if the required disclosure regarding that vaccine were made. So we can be sued. So if most of you nurses would someday fly and go to the United States of America and work as nurses there, and you accidentally inoculated the patient, then it would open you to a civil suit for damages in case the patient with the file a complaint for headache or vomiting or chest pains. So it is important that before you inoculate, before you inject the vaccine, there should be consent. It would be better that he signs a consent form prepared by the hospital, or if you would be working in the government, there should be a consent form prepared by the Department of Health. Likewise, an informed refusal of vaccination would be negated by the inadequate disclosure of the same information, in particular, of the benefits of vaccination and the fact that the risk associated with COVID-19 infection far outweigh the risk of vaccination. In the city of Canlaon, we have 12 deaths in the past 4 weeks. So because, and most of these deaths are those patients who refuse vaccination. They are unvaccinated. So because of that, a lot of people rush to the vaccination center to be vaccinated because they found out that more people die who are unvaccinated than those who are vaccinated. So this erases the fear of the side effects of vaccination because they now focus on the protection that the vaccines will give to COVID-19. So this is a problem here. People will wait for someone to die before they get vaccinated. So hopefully, according to our governor, uh, Ruel Digamo of Negros Oriental, if we have 800,000 will be vaccinated, he will now be opening Negros Oriental to the whole Philippines, stating that we are now fully vaccinated. Even according to him, we vaccinate 800,000 individuals. Next slide, please. This extensive disclosure requirement can raise problems. What if a particular person is not told about the least risky COVID-19 vaccine for them, and they develop serious complications from the vaccine administered that was not the least risky one? Have they given their informed consent to the vaccine given? So this is the importance of information. This is the importance of consent, because you now transfer the risk or the obligation from you as health professionals to the patient. So the decision making will now fall in the hands of the patient. So if they make a wrong decision, as long as they give a consent to the vaccination, and as long as they were fully informed, then it will protect you from any damage suit that the family might file in case of complications. Next slide, please. If the least risky vaccine is not available, subject to its unavailability not being the fault of some authority with the responsibility for providing vaccines, there is probably no ethical or legal breach for not disclosing its existence. So again, we're talking about options. So you have to present the options to the patient, especially the paying patient. Because as you know, in the Philippines, vaccination is free. But according to government authorities, once they reach a number of a higher percentage of the population being inoculated, they will stop giving it for free. So patients will now rush to hospitals and clinics, and we will now pay for it. So our job as health professionals and nurses, we'll have to give them options. What do you want? Would you want an AstraZeneca? Would you want a Moderna? Would you want a Pfizer? And of course, you will inform them of the price, because once they start paying, vaccines will not come so cheap. So you have to inform them of the pros and cons. You have to inform them of the availability of other vaccines. So if you fail to do so, again, this will open you to a damage suit in case they experience side effects. Next slide, please. That said, it is controversial topic in medical ethics in general, whether treatments which are indicated as treatment or prophylaxis for the patient but are not available, they must be disclosed in order to obtain informed consent to the treatment provided. So aside from telling your patients of the side effects, you should tell them what vaccines are available. So maybe 2 weeks ago, 2 to 3 years from now, there'll be hundreds of vaccines available. So I don't know how we tell them, but legal ethics mandate that they should be informed. Next slide, please. A further complexity is what if the least risky vaccine will become available, but not, let us say, for 6 months, as is true of sufficient quantities of the Pfizer vaccine. Does everyone at least have to be told of the Pfizer vaccine and its future planned availability in order to obtain their informed consent to the AstraZeneca vaccine at present? So these are questions that you have to answer, which is part of our ethical considerations. You have to inform them that, okay, if you want to be vaccinated, as for AstraZeneca, we have available, but in 6 months, we'll have Pfizer coming in. That's what I did. I waited. When vaccination started in March, me and my family have to wait for Pfizer because, as you know, I think Pfizer and there are some brands that are allowed if you go to Canada or the United States. Not all vaccines are allowed. In fact, there was one nurse who got inoculated with AstraZeneca. After he found out that he's leaving for Canada, he had himself inoculated again with Pfizer. I don't know what effect will it have on her, but yeah, he was vaccinated twice. So for well, the good thing is I still see her on Facebook, and she's still alive. Next slide, please. What if, however, the vaccine is available but in limited quantities, and by the government or bureaucratic decree is not being offered to the group of people to which the person belongs? Keep in mind that the doctor or a nurse like you has a primary obligation of personal care to each individual patient. You have to inform them. Of course, it is not our job to procure. All we have to do is inform them of what is available in the hospital, what is available in 6 months, what is available next month. But this is part of information. Next slide, please. What does it mean? This means that they must always put that patient's best interest first. That is, before our own interests as nurses and health professionals and those of other people. Let us take an example. Next slide, please. Both AstraZeneca and Pfizer vaccines are being administered to Filipinos, but there are limited quantities of the Pfizer vaccine, and with certain exceptions, it is not being offered to people 50 years of age or over. I'm really familiar with this because I haven't been practicing as a physical therapist or health professional for a long time. I've been a lawyer for 17 years, but I have never been uh, exposed to a patient during that time also. But as nurses, you will know why they don't give Pfizer vaccine to people 50 years or over. Next slide, please. What if someone over 50 could be at more risk of blood clots than the general over 50 population? For example, what are the doctor's obligations to a woman patient aged 55 years who is taking postmenopausal hormone therapy if she's diabetic and has previously suffered a deep vein thrombosis or DVT? Should the doctor offer her the AstraZeneca vaccine? What can you do? What can you do, or what can you contribute as nurses? Next slide, please. The first question is, what are the doctor's ethical and legal obligations to this particular patient? Just because of the government has pronounced a policy or guidelines does not mean that the doctor following those guidelines is acting ethically or even legally. So take note of that. So you don't just follow guidelines and rely on it, thinking that you don't have any ethical or legal responsibility. Next slide, please. To avoid medical negligence or malpractice, the doctor or a nurse must act with the parameters of what is reasonably careful and a competent doctor or nurse and would not do in any circumstances, including with respect to the range of treatments offered and obtaining informed consent to the treatment chosen by the patient. That can require taking a different path from that articulated in the guidelines. So as long as you follow what is ethical, you don't need to follow guidelines, because some guidelines are prepared by persons who are not even health professionals. to know about the risk involved in vaccination are you, the nurses, the doctors, and the health professionals. The second question is, next slide, please. If this patient is offered the AstraZeneca vaccine, must she also be offered the Pfizer vaccine, assuming that it could be obtained in order to obtain her informed consent to accepting the AstraZeneca vaccine? Will you tell them? Is it your job to inform AstraZeneca available? However, if you're close to a government official, you can always get the Pfizer vaccine. Will you tell them that? That's a question we need to answer. Next slide, please. In other words, if she accepts the AstraZeneca vaccine without being offered the Pfizer vaccine, is her consent to the AstraZeneca vaccine ethically and legally valid? That is a question you have to ask. This question leads beyond information requirements for informed consent, requirement for an ethically and legally valid consent. That is voluntariness. And its requirements that the person's consent must not be tainted with coercion, duress, or undue influence. Discussing shortly. Because as nurses, you should know what these terms mean. You should know what coercion means. You should know what duress means or undue influence. Next slide, please. Yet another question is, if the Pfizer vaccine is available, whether or not in limited quantities, and the Philippines has a large stockpile of the AstraZeneca vaccine, may the government still limit the availability of the Pfizer vaccine to those under 55 years of age? So those are difficult questions, but those are ethical questions which you need to answer. So we should not limit ourselves with what is given to us. We should also investigate what is available. Because for all we know, the government is keeping these expensive vaccines, which the public is wanting to avail of. Next slide, please. It is difficult, perhaps almost impossible, to argue that this could be justified. That difficulty is augmented by the fact that recent research found that mRNA-based vaccines, Pfizer does not seem to have additional benefits, that they are effective against at least some variants of the COVID-19 virus, and possibly many of them. So this is where the problem comes up. Not all of them have the same effect. Some have good effects from other variants, some have not. So we have to tell them what is available and let them. The bottom line is, we go back to the basics. Informed consent. We have to inform them to get their consent. Next step, please. Next slide, please. Now, let's proceed to disclosure and perception of risk. As medical professionals, we should disclose everything what a vaccine brings to the human body. We should also tell the risks. The seriousness and probability of risk is always relevant to whether they need to be disclosed. The more serious and the more probable a risk, the more likely it is that it must be disclosed. If there is a risk of cerebral thrombosis, there is a risk of death, so you have to inform the client about that. It must be disclosed. The difference between knowing and appreciating the risk is also relevant. I had my second dose of Pfizer almost a week ago. And 3 days after, one of my clients called me telling me that it causes myocarditis. I have to read on that because I was not informed. So if I develop myocarditis because of Pfizer, and if I wasn't informed of its effect or its risk, then I could sue the person who inoculated me. I could sue the Department of Health for not informing of its risks, because it is my choice whether I have to be vaccinated or not. So we go back to the basics. Vaccination is always voluntary. In workplaces, even the Department of Labor and Employment, they have been telling people or employers that it is illegal to tell your employees that no vaccine, no work policy. It cannot be done because it is a violation of a constitutional right of a person. So again, we go back to the basic law of the land, which is the Constitution, which give each and every Filipinos the right to choose whether to be vaccinated or not vaccinated. Next slide, please. Many people have difficulty understanding probability, namely that statistics are true for a group but not for any one person, which can be a barrier to understanding the risk and appreciating the likely consequences of running or refusing to run it. Next slide, please. In addition, the comparative or relative risk of various options regarding vaccination is a relevant fact that should be disclosed. The risk of developing blood clot is not only a risk of vaccination, but also a risk inherent in being infected with COVID-19. So we have to tell. So again, the bottom line is information. Information brings consent. That's the reason why we had an informed consent. This is not uh, a regular or a simple consent. It should be informed consent. Next slide, please. In fact, 1 in 4 people with COVID-19 admitted to intensive care units develop blood clots, and yet around 25% of them die. In a yet unpublished study from Oxford University, researchers found out that COVID-19 infection is up to 10 times more likely to cause blood clots than vaccination with the Pfizer or Moderna or mRNA vaccine. So you have to tell them that. Otherwise, you get sued for medical malpractice. No, that is a problem here in the Philippines because when I was vaccinated, I was with 800 other people. We were not informed of anything. They just stuck a needle in my arm and that's it. So if these people develop blood clots, then we're talking about a lawsuit. AstraZeneca vaccine is not an mRNA vaccine. You all know that, you're nurses. But it is too far less likely to cause clots than infection with COVID-19. So that's an important thing. Next slide, please. Factors other than seriousness and probability of risk are also relevant in people's decision-making regarding whether to run a particular risk. People can view risks that appear to result from chance very differently from those resulting from a choice to impose the risk made by an identified decision maker. So who are an identified decision maker? The patient. It is not the doctor, not the nurses, but the patient. So what you do is you inform them of the risk so that they can make a decision by themselves. Next slide, please. So after this, we're gonna have there's gonna be a short talk because I'm supposed to talk only for 45 minutes, but I found out that there will be a portion where you ask questions. I would welcome that. So I'm actually down to my few slides already. I'll just finish this one. Basically, just to summarize, the ethical consideration is more on decision making. You have to help the patient make the right decisions. Let us proceed. There are much more tolerant of risk, talking about the patient, seemingly arising by chance than by another person's or institution's choice. In short, patients can have different reactions to harm seen as resulting from an act of God as compared with harm resulting from an act of a healthcare professional. We're talking about chance. The other one is resulting from choice. Next slide, please. As we already noted, the person who refuses vaccination with AstraZeneca vaccine runs a greater risk of infection with COVID-19 since it doesn't have any protection. And if infected of serious complications than if they had accepted vaccination. So this is what we talked about a while ago, that we're making choices. If we have a vaccination, we're facing risk of side effects. If we don't have vaccination, we're talking about risk of being infected by COVID-19. So this is just walking in a tightrope. Whether you fall left or right, the thing is you will always fall. Next slide, please. However, if this risk of refusing AstraZeneca vaccination materializes, it is likely to be seen as having arising from chance, whereas blood clots caused by the vaccine are likely to be seen as caused by an unidentified agent. This could be the doctor or nurse who gave the jab, or the government, which allocated the probably less risky Pfizer vaccine to others, or all of these decision makers and actors. So, titatanan mo na isala, ani. But nevertheless, as healthcare professionals, the ball is always in your hand, and my job as a lawyer and a healthcare professional, because I'm still a licensed physical therapist, although I haven't been in a rehab facility for 17 years, is to inform you how to act when faced with this ethical consideration. Ethical responsibility is not like a football. You no longer have it when you throw it to someone else. It is more of like a cake. Everyone can have a slice. So you take the risk as doctors, you take the risk as nurse, you take the risk as a patient. So natutungakon. So all of us has a slice. All of us has a role to play. Next slide, please. Risk have a dread factor. The more familiar, the lower the dread factor. So you have to inform them of the risk. And the more unfamiliar the risk, the higher the dread factor. The higher the dread factor, the more likely the person is to refuse to run the risk. So once again, our job is to inform the patient so that they can make the right decision of which risk to take. Next slide, please. An example is the fact that the person take the risk of being killed in a car accident every day, but they will refuse to fly, even though the risk of death from a plane crash is far lower than that incurred in travel by a car. A plane crash has much higher dread factor than a car crash. So you have to notice that some people make bad decisions. So, but even if they make a bad decision, a decision is a decision made by the patient. So once we inform them of all the risk, then our job is done. We will not have any ethical problems anymore. Next slide, please. Risks also have a time factor. The more immediate the materialization of the risk could be, the less tolerance there is for chancing it. The further away from the consequences, the less weight the risk is given. The long-term risk of developing lung cancer from smoking is a good example of the latter. Of course, you know this, you're nurses, right? Next slide, please. COVID-19 vaccination is an immediate risk of medical complications. The risk from contracting COVID-19 are possibly not as immediate, at least in the Philippines. So that's a problem. Once you jab, the medical complications are right there and then. It's immediate. So you cannot just say that once you jab, there are no medical complications. There is, but the risk of contracting COVID-19 is not immediate. Maybe he will have a COVID-19 infection 2 weeks, 3 weeks later, or maybe a year. So that's why it's very, very difficult to make such decision. Next slide, please. Psychologists have found that in evaluating whether to run a particular risk, people make the opposite decision from their last worst risk-taking decision. So for instance, engineers who decided the dam wall was safe, even though that there was a risk it was not, and the dam broke, engulfing a small town and killing many people, the next time they evaluated the dam wall found it to be unsafe, even if it is still safe because of the risk. So that is the effect, the psychological effect of risk-taking. Next slide, please. The individual's last word decision regarding the risk of prophylactic medical treatment will also from person to person. So we have to take note of that. Sometimes a neighbor dies because of vaccination. So the neighbor who's alive will not anymore have a vaccination because of that. They refuse to take the risk. Next slide, please. Then, beyond the obvious ones, which risks fall within the disclosure requirements? So that is a question that you as nurses should think about. The risk of blood clots from AstraZeneca vaccine is present for 2 weeks or more after vaccination. There has been even suggestions up to 12 months. Next slide, please. Is the psychological stress of living with that possibility and a chance of developing clinically significant anxiety disorder as a result a risk that needs to be disclosed? What about the fact that there is no established treatment for the vaccine-induced blood clots? So this is very difficult. Take note. I'd like to reiterate that statement. There is no established treatment for vaccine-induced blood clots. All of it is in its experimental stage. I spoke to one doctor. He said, like, all of the tests will be finished 10 years from now. But what did we do? Even if we are in the early stages of testing vaccines, we jab it right away because we're in a state of emergency and prayed that a lot of people will live from the jab more than those who will die because of blood clots. So, but it's good. No? But studies show that a small percentage die as compared to those who are saved. But we don't know 6 months from now or 2 years from now what the effect of these vaccines will have in our body. So, again, this is, some people say that we are in the third world war. We're not fighting each other, but we're fighting a virus. But sad to say, some politician says that China won in this war without firing a single shot. Let us proceed. Next slide, please. In addition, must the over 20% fatality rate of the people who develop vaccine-induced clots be disclosed? Should we tell the patient that 20% of those who develop blood clots die? These are very difficult questions in which there will not be consensus regarding the answers. So again, this is what the ethical considerations are about. Should we tell or should we not tell? The answer is we should tell so that they can come up with a decision by themselves. Otherwise, if you do not tell and they decided to be jabbed and they develop blood clots, then you would be sued for medical malpractice. Next slide, please. The impact of both mainstream and social media on the public's perception of risk is also an important consideration in a post-truth world. That's what the previous speaker talked to us about. What do you call this? A fake news. It's in a post-truth world. This is the first time I had this term. That media too must act ethically and responsibly in their communications and not exploit people's fear regarding COVID-19 or vaccination just in order to increase their audience share. So we're not talking about ethics only of medical professionals, but also I've been practicing that one also because I've been in the media for the past 6 years. I have my own radio program, and in fact, they gave me an ID with the name media on it. So first, see that ID. Anyway, let us proceed. Next slide, please. Let's talk about voluntariness. So during my introduction, I spoke about that vaccination should be voluntary. The doctrine to effect respect for the patient's autonomy and the right to self-determination. Voluntariness requires that the patient's consent to treatment must be free of coercion, duress, or undue influence. Next slide, please. Mandatory vaccination raises many complex ethical and human rights issues, including the fact that it would bypass informed consent. In situations that clearly fulfill all of the requirements for the doctrine of necessity, it can be justified as an exception to the basic presumption that the persons or their legal surrogate decision makers' informed consent to medical treatment is always required. Next slide, please. Protection of public health is a long-established domain of such exceptions. We note that some people will strongly disagree that any exceptions are ethical. In fact, there has been debate in the Senate to pass a law to make vaccination mandatory. So their debate or their arguments are anchored on this backbone that public health is a public responsibility. We're talking about herd immunity. But again, This will be in conflict with the Constitution, the basic right of a person towards self-determination. So this is still under debate, but so far, the vaccination is voluntary, still subsists. Let us proceed. Next slide, please. However, duress or undue influence can be less direct. For example, a person can be told that their continuing employment depends on their being vaccinated. So that is duress. The no vaccine, no work policy, and the worker comes to you and says like, okay, I'll have myself vaccinated. He is already uh, giving his consent because of duress. Hindi siya katrabaho. This demand is more likely to be justified where it is necessary to protect vulnerable people from exposure to COVID-19. Those who are fragile or have disabilities, such as residents of aged care homes. There have been stories of that the people in homes in Spain, they all died. I don't know if it's true, huh? But when uh, COVID broke out last year, I heard about news of that. I don't even know if it's still fake news or not. Next slide, please. The employee has an option of resigning, but the consent to vaccination is not entirely free. What about the people over 50 who would choose to have the Pfizer vaccine but are offered only the AstraZeneca vaccine? Is their consent to the latter sufficiently free? The answer is no. So you have to make sure that the consent is freely given. That is why the no work, no vaccine policy is illegal. Let us proceed. Let us go to the final considerations. A lot of you are feeling already. Anyway, as a student, I never like talks or seminars, especially when the speaker is not in front of you. You can just turn on the laptop, turn off the what do you call this, the camera, and we will not know if you're sleepy or not. But nevertheless, if you have been listening for me for the past half hour, you will know a lot about what we call this ethics. So we began by pointing out the four levels of decision making. This is to recap. That is discussion of the requirements of the informed consent to focus on the micro or individual level. However, all the other levels may be concurrently taken into account. The protection and promotion of the common good can modify what otherwise would be required at the individual level, including what is required to obtain an individual's person's informed consent. Next slide, please. It is important to recognize that the values which apply to different can be in conflict. For instance, at the micro level, an individual doctor treating an individual patient must not put the common good before the patient's interest. So it's always the patient's best interest. Next slide, please. In contrast, at the level, if a hospital is to act justly, it might be ethically required to give priority to the best interest of all patients at the expense of the individual's best interest. Next slide, please. The most likely situation in relation to COVID-19, where the common good can take priority over the respect for individual autonomy, at the macro level, when the protection of public health clearly requires coercive intervention, such as lockdown or social distancing. So even if vaccination is voluntary, the government still mandates that there will be lockdown or social distancing to prevent the spread of the virus. So this is an example of the the common good taking priority over respect for individual autonomy. Kung daghan kayo ng reklamo nga di sila kabiyahe, so they invoke their right to travel. But the government always say that the common good, no, is the supreme law of the land. There's a Latin saying of that, the supreme law, the law. Forget about that. I'll just check that later. Next slide, please. It is a truism in ethics, but no less important being such that good facts are essential for good ethics. Remember, good facts are essential for good ethics. Dealing with COVID-19 or COVID-19 vaccines involves many situations of unavoidable uncertainty with respect to the facts. So you should give good facts. We need to keep in mind that many ethical mistakes are made when we are frightened of living in what that uncertainty and convert it to false certainty, in which case we are certain, but we are ethically wrong. There is an ever-present danger in the political and public policy sphere, especially under the guise of the "we mustn't panic the public" syndrome, sometimes used by the government bureaucrats to avoid transparency and being blamed for the harmful outcomes of their decisions. Intention matters in ethics. The same decision might be ethical if made for one reason, but unethical if made for another reason. Let us test this by looking at the federal government's decision about access to the Pfizer vaccine. Next slide, please. Vaccine, with some exceptions, will only be offered to people in general under 50 years of age. A majority of those who have developed blood clots are women. Should the government policy be to offer women the Pfizer vaccine rather than people under 50? So this is what the government is facing. Next slide, please. This would be to substitute sex discrimination for age discrimination. Or was the decision based on reasoning that those under 50 are less at risk in waiting for the Pfizer vaccine than those over 50? Or was the reasoning something else? Next slide, please. In short, to judge the ethical acceptability of this decision, we need to know the risk or benefit calculus on which it was based. Without those facts, we cannot properly judge its ethical acceptability. So that ends my talk. I hope you're not sleeping. You can now ask questions with regards to ethics and legal actions with regards to those decisions made without conforming to ethical standards. Thank you very much and good afternoon.
Thank you for that informative and enlightening speech, Attorney Monte Alegre. I hope the participants have already made their decision in getting the vaccination for those who have not taken it yet. And thank you also for emphasizing the importance of informed consent.
Now, for the open forum, just like what we did a while ago, participants may address their questions and clarifications to the speaker by raising your virtual hand, or you may use the chat box. Please wait for the facilitator to recognize you before turning on your microphones. If you have any queries, you may already raise it now.
So we have here a question from Eldred Pondias. This is his questions, attorney. Naakoy kaila nga taga Manila, then naa siya critical condition, then nagpa-consult na siya sa iyang personal doctor. Then ingon ang doctor nga dili pwede ka mabaksinan kay you have critical condition. So mao nga nagpahimo na lang siya og medical certification. Makapugos ba ang school nga dili maka-attend sa face-to-face tungod kay dili mabaksinan ang student kay tungod sa iyang critical condition?
That is a very interesting question. No? Again, the doctor should not have said no right away. He should have the proper way is to tell the patient the risk of or the side effects of the vaccine, the available vaccines, because in both ways there's always a risk. No, there is a risk in one hand if you don't get vaccinated. You don't get you will have a higher you have a possibility of being infected by COVID. So in fact, a lot of during the first speaker, I think 4.9 million worldwide already died. On the other hand, if you get vaccinated, you have this risk factors. So what the doctor should have done is to give the patient the right to choose or to come up with their own decision, not say no. We don't say no. We just guide them on what to do. So that will answer the first question. But the second question is about face-to-face. Can you repeat that, the last because there are two questions. Can you read the question regarding face-to-face?
Makapugos ba ang school nga dili maka-attend sa face-to-face tungod kay dili mabaksinan ang student kay tungod sa iyang critical condition?
How dili ka kapugos kay kanang ang risgo moadto na sa school kay kung pugson maka face to face niya wala mabaksinan niya dayon nagka COVID makabayad ang eskwelahan ana, no, makabayad siya. In fact, kung magpugson mo sa eskwelahan niya magka COVID mo, we can sue the school to pay for your medical bills, and the average stay in a hospital for 2 weeks is close to about 500,000 to a million kabayad ang UB ana. So I would suggest to the school authorities to hold first the face-to-face classes until after everyone is vaccinated or everyone is sure that they will not be infected with COVID. Next question, please.
Okay, participants, do you have any other questions? You may already drop it in the chat box. We will be waiting for 10 seconds, and if there's no more question, we will be proceeding to the next segment. So I think the discussion, attorney, is very clear and our participants really get your point. So thank you, participants, for raising your questions, and thank you, Attorney Monte Alegre, for answering them. Now, to formally express our gratitude to you, Attorney Monte Alegre, allow us to present this certificate and token of appreciation for you.
Certificate of Appreciation is presented to Attorney Dax Maloney P. Monte Alegre for sharing his expertise as a resource speaker during the webinar on compulsory or voluntary ethical considerations for COVID-19 vaccination with respect to patients' rights, held via MS Teams on October 22nd, 2021 from 1 o'clock p.m. to 3:30 p.m. this afternoon, given this 22nd day of October 2021, signed by our program coordinator, Madam Jessica V. Siloria, MAN, RN, DPE, our OIC Dean, College of Allied Health Sciences, Madam Yvonne M. Sevilla, MON, RN, RM, DPE, and our instructor, Dr. Hermesal Munoz.
We have also prepared a personalized tumbler as a token of appreciation for you. Now, at this point, may we request everyone to turn on your cameras again and show us your sweetest smiles for the final opportunity with our resource speaker. Okay, at the count of 3, 1, 2, 3, smile! Okay, another wacky pose. 1, 2, 3, smile!
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, guys, for attending our webinar today. We would also like to express our gratitude to our Dean, Mrs. Yvonne Sevilla, to our program coordinator, Ma'am Jessica Siloria, to our subject instructor, Dr. Hermesal Munoz, and to the rest of the faculty and staff. Thank you so much for your support.
Thank you so much to our resource speakers for giving us your time and for sharing your expertise this afternoon. To our dear participants, we are putting the link on the chat box for the evaluation and attendance. Please answer it so you could claim your certificate of participation.
Now, to formally conclude the program, may we call on Ms. Angelica May Peñales to deliver her closing remarks, to be followed by the UV heat.
It is but an honor that we have this privilege today to be able to discuss
these topics truly relevant and principal in our time living in this pandemic. Being students of high level of eagerness to learn, we are blessed of these ideas and experiences that our speakers have imparted upon us. At the end of this webinar, we are now able to be conscious of the myths, distinguish false and credible information, and most of all, believe in the efficacy and benefits vaccines give, outweighing the disadvantages. Moreover, the rights we have as recipients of healthcare has been shed light, knowing we have to respect and ultimately preserve the dignity of both ourselves and our clients. We from the Group C would like to express our wholehearted gratitude to our speakers, Mr. Nino Jan Vergara Mayole and Attorney Dax Maloney Montealegre, for generously giving time and sharing their expertise upon our webinar's topics. Our thankfulness also goes to our healthcare bioethics instructor, Dr. Hermesal Munoz, and our beloved Dean Yvonne M. Sevilla for giving us this opportunity and approving to our objectives. Of course, we also thank and appreciate our amazing program coordinator, Madam Jessica Celoria, for the unwavering support and guidance. Finally, we would not forget to thank our exemplary leader, Ms. Priyan Pailado, for spearheading the preparations and constantly checking on our progress along with all of our group's constituents in the lively cooperation for making this webinar activity possible. In the long run, we are able to be successful in unifying our goals. Most of all, to our participants in this webinar for the participation and staying in tune with us until the very end of our program. I would wish to end this webinar activity by sharing with all of you, our valued participants, this quote. It's your reaction to adversity, not adversity itself, that determines how your life story will develop. Dieter F. Uchtdorf. With our sincere appreciation, thank you so much from the Group C, BSN 2A1. This is Angelica May Penales. Have a splendid day, everyone.
We stand to the alma mater, flame of love that been shining brighter. Held we shout, we cheer forever. Love and service all we uphold. It's the pride of dear Miss Ionia. Joyful hearts we sing together. Seek the truth, the fountain of knowledge. Draw near, alma mater near. We stand up and go, go, go! Love and serve humanity. With the heart we love to see. We will always be the witness as to thee. We say onward, keep the UV spirit burning. Our beloved dear alma mater. With our hearts we pray forevermore. We say let's go, go, go! Love and serve humanity. With the heart we love to see. We will always be the witness as to thee. We say onward, keep the UV spirit burning. Our beloved dear alma mater. With our hearts we pray forevermore.
Once again, thank you everyone. We are so glad to have you all here. This is Priyan Patrins Pailado
And this is Kristen Angulang,
your Masters of Ceremony, now signing off. Thank you and may God bless us all. Have a good day, everyone.
Thank you.